I'll pick this up. Thanks, Dale. And Dale didn't give himself any credit, but the reason I'm here is because he invited me, so I appreciate him organizing this and sticking with it and reminding me that I'm doing it and stuff like that. So anyway, I'm really happy to be here. I love the coast of Lake Michigan, and this is a beautiful little town that I can understand why sometimes people move from Green Bay and retire here or something, or maybe commute. So I think it's a beautiful place. I'm happy to be here. I drove over on 54, of course, and I saw people picking up trash on the side of the road in New Franken, and so that was kind of nice to see. There's a lot of other people out here, not only enjoying this beautiful day, but getting involved with trying to improve their environment. I'm really happy to be able to give this talk today. I have to tell you that I took my own vehicle. There's a statewide travel ban on professors traveling right now because of the budget cuts that are on the docket, and I just want to let you know that I love coming out here and talking, but those budget cuts that are coming up could have a really devastating effect on the university system here in Wisconsin and on my ability to come and give these sorts of talks. So if you appreciate professors coming out and doing this kind of thing, sharing with you, you might want to think about letting your local politician know that you appreciate this service that the UW system provides. It's all about the Wisconsin idea. The university is supposed to help the citizens of Wisconsin. That's what it's all about. So anyway, I'm glad to be here today, and I want to talk. I'm an arachnologist, but I love birds. I'm not a birder. I'll explain that in a little bit. I'm not really a birder, but I love birds, and I want to sort of get at people that like birds and try to get them to appreciate these arachnids, spiders especially. I'm a spider specialist, and their kin. Arachnids include other animals, and talk a little bit about why I think you should appreciate them. And I know that you might not be trading in your binoculars for a magnifying loupe or anything, but still, I think that there's a lot to pay attention to, and it kind of makes the whole environment a little bit more interesting if you look at these other things too. So next slide. I want to acknowledge some people, especially I want to acknowledge all the photographers whose photos I basically stole off the internet to give this talk. I'm not a great photographer, and there's just so many awesome natural history photographers out there now doing really difficult work. It's not easy to take a picture of a very small animal. And so I want to acknowledge, I don't always cite all of these people or always get their permission, but it's really important the kind of work they're doing. I also want to mention that this is one of the easiest talks I've ever had to prepare, because I'm a member of this email list of all these arachnologists. And I mentioned to them that I was interested in giving a talk about arachnid bird connections. And I'm not a specialist on that. That's not something that I actually study. I'm just interested in it. And everybody had stories, and everybody was interested in this. So I got a lot of the interesting stories that I'm going to tell you about today from all of these, basically from the arachnological community all around the world. And so I thank them. And I also have a colleague at UW Green Bay. Of course, we're sort of known for ornithology. There's a real tradition of studying birds at UW Green Bay. And the head of that at this time is Bob Howe. And so he helped me out a little bit with some bird identifications and a few stories as well. So I want to thank him. Okay, next. Next one. Okay, so I'm going to talk first about these two lineages of animals and just kind of get you to think about birds and arachnids the way I think about them, as part of the tree of life, part of it, this interconnected, and related life on Earth. Next. And then I want to talk about some similarities between birds and spiders. There's actually, I sort of think of them as both really cool animals, and I want you to start to think about them that way if possible. Some people just have a thing about spiders and maybe aren't capable of that, but I want you to at least intellectually think about them that way. And then, a lot of the talk is going to be about these, connections, especially ecological connections between birds and arachnids. And that's the thing I really want to impress you with, is that if you have a habitat that has good birds, it's going to have a lot of spiders. If you're protecting the habitat for spiders, it's great for birds too. So there's a lot of connections there. Okay, so first of all, these animals are related to each other. Spiders and birds actually have a common ancestor. We're, of course, all animals. I call, insects and spiders, I call them animals, and that's not just a figure of speech. They really are animals, just like us and just like birds. And we're in this big group called the bilaterally symmetrical animals. Next. And this is basically the little tree leading to birds. The birds are deuterostomes. This big kind of animal like we're deuterostomes as well. And spiders are in a different group. We're in the same phylum as birds, Chordata. We're in the same subphylum as birds, the Vertebrata. We're in the same group of terrestrial vertebrates as birds, but they're in a different group of amniotes. They're actually reptiles. I don't know if you've heard the news lately, but birds are actually more closely related to some reptiles than those reptiles are to other reptiles. So they're nested within reptiles, and they're very unusual, very specialized, very successful reptiles, but nevertheless, they are reptiles. And in fact, they're in the group called the Dinosauria. They're actually most closely related to these, extinct, huge dinosaurs. And a lot of people say, dinosaurs actually aren't extinct. They're still around. Those are birds. Birds actually kind of are dinosaurs in a way. They're a modified form of dinosaur. So they're in their own class Aves. Next. And then this is the group, this is where spiders come out. They're in a completely different group of animals. They're called protostomes. A lot of worms and snails and slugs and things, those are all protostomes. And they're in this biggest phylum of all, the more species of arthropods than any other group of organisms, not just animals. The arthropods, that's a huge group of animals, including insects, spiders, centipedes, millipedes, and of course crustaceans, the lobsters and stuff. And then there's a class of 8-legged arthropods with, instead of having jaws, they have fangs or pincers for mouth parts. And those are arachnids. And there's actually 11 different kinds of arachnids. There's just 4 that live around here. And these are the 4 that I'm going to talk about. There's 3 that live around here. The spiders, the Draney, the acari or mites, and then pseudoscorpions. I don't know if you've heard about pseudoscorpions. I'll show you a picture of those later. And then one that doesn't live in Wisconsin is the scorpions, but everybody knows about scorpions, and I want to tell a few stories about those as well. Okay, so let's go to the next one. Why would somebody study spiders instead of birds? I really thought about birders when I was giving this talk, and people are like, why would you want to spend your life studying spiders when there are birds that you could be spending your life studying? So let me tell you about that. First, this is important. I'm extremely nearsighted, and even with my glasses, it's not really 20/20. So when I'm out there with birders, they're always like, oh, "Can't you see that bird over there? That second branch up." And I'm always the last person to see the bird, and it doesn't look red and yellow to me. It looks like a little gray blob, and so I'm just not very good at it. I've tried, and I love birds, but I'm not a very good birder. Next. The other thing is, as a scientist, I'm trying to contribute new knowledge, to humanity, and it's a lot harder to do that with birds because everybody studies birds, and there's a lot of people. Think about this: there's more ornithologists on the planet than there are species of birds. There are. So there's like one for every scientist can have their own bird to study. When you talk about arthropods, there are more than 2,000 species for every biologist that studies arthropods. And so it's like we each could have 2,000 all to our own if we wanted to. So a lot less is known, and there's a lot less competition among arachnologists too. We're all really friendly with each other because we're not stepping on each other's toes. Ornithologists can be a little bit defensive about these are mine actually. so there's that too. I like the arachnologists. And then the other thing I want to make a point is that, actually birds are awesome, but so are spiders. They're really fascinating animals. The only reason they don't get as much attention, I think, is because they're so small. They tend to be smaller than birds, of course, a lot smaller, and so people just don't pay as much attention to them. But if you magnify them, you can see they're just as interesting as a tiger or a lion or anything like that. Okay, so I've got 10 similarities between birds and spiders. And this is the first one. We were talking about the lineages. Both of these lineages are really ancient. They've been on the planet for a long time. They're very diverse, a lot of species, and they're really successful ecologically. So, next. So birds emerged about 160 million years ago. In the age of the dinosaurs, there are already birds. Next. And there's about 10,000 species of birds that have been described. Most of them have been described, we think. There's not very many that haven't been found yet, but about 10,000. And then it's the largest group, the most diverse group of four-legged vertebrates. So, more than lizards and snakes, and quite a few more, almost twice as many birds as mammals. Next. So spiders are even older than the birds. They emerged in the Devonian period and are some of the first land animals, right, that evolved on land. So that was, more than almost 400 million years ago, right, 40% of a billion years ago. Next. And there's a lot. There's even 4 times more spider species than there are bird species. So, and the thing is, this is the number described, but probably there's almost as many undescribed living in rainforests and places like that. And when I go to Panama, I find undescribed ones routinely that I know that no one knows what they are. So there's a lot of undescribed ones left. Very diverse group. They're the 7th most diverse order of animals. And most of the other ones are other arthropods. So we've got ants, wasps, and bees, beetles, butterflies and moths, flies, bugs, true bugs, and then one more is mites. And then after that are spiders. So it's a big group, and it's the biggest group of animals that has all predators. So there's some other groups that have all predators, right? Like dragonflies and damselflies. That's a pretty big group, but not nearly as big as spiders. So it's an interesting group too. Okay, so another thing that I like to think about is that these lineages are very heterogeneous. That is, if you say bird, you could be thinking of a very different animal. Different people could be thinking of completely different animals, right? It's incredible how diverse birds are when you start to think about it. And so these are just a couple of my favorites. Some of the hummingbirds are definitely overlapped with insects in their size, and they actually are doing the same thing that butterflies and moths are doing with pollinating, except they're daytime instead of nighttime, right? So it's really almost like a little butterfly, a hummingbird. And then these are extinct now. It's probably good for us because this animal is 3 meters tall, and it lived in Central America about, in the recent past, about 13 million years ago. And those things could definitely eat people, I'd say, if there had been any people in Central America back then. So they went extinct before people got here, so it's not really our fault or anything. But, it's easy to see how that's a dinosaur. It's not a stretch, right? And then we've got, of course, these amazing flyers, and then weird ones like, have you ever thought about what a woodpecker does? It slams its head against wood as hard as it can to get bugs out. And any other bird, it would just completely vaporize its brain, right? I mean, that's way worse than pro football for your brain there. It's amazing that they can do that. That's an incredible thing. And then this is I think these are my favorite birds. I don't think people forget about how weird that is. These birds probably lived in Antarctica many millions of years ago, their ancestors, and then it just kept getting colder and colder, and they kept getting more and more adapted to life in Antarctica, and they live underwater most of the time. They're really aquatic organisms, and they're fast enough swimmers to get fish. That's what they live on, is fish. And then they reproduce on Antarctica, where there's no other vertebrates that live there. It's too cold, and so it's an amazing lineage of creatures. Okay, next. Well, spiders are also very heterogeneous. So when you say spider, you don't know what you're looking at here. They actually vary in size just as much as birds do. Between a hummingbird and some kind of big eagle or something, there's probably about 1,000, maybe almost 10,000 times heavier, right? So that's like maybe 4 orders of magnitude in size. Well, the same thing is the case with spiders. So this big spider here from Africa, probably weighs about 1/4 of a pound. And that's about 10,000 times heavier than this little thing, which is about 1 millimeter long. Okay, and it's actually a really cool animal. It's got these really long jaws, and it closes them like a mouse trap. It doesn't use muscles, it uses stored energy, just like a mouse trap, a spring. And it's one of the fastest animal movements on the planet. So it can catch these little spring tails. And so there's all kinds of awesome spiders. Some of them are even cute, right? This is kind of a cute animal. I mean, not everyone would think it was cute, but I think they're pretty cute. And some people that are afraid of spiders tell me they're not actually afraid of these jumping spiders, because they're like little teddy bears. They've got these big eyes, and they're very fuzzy, and their legs are short. they would never think about biting you. They're way too small to bite you. But they're curious, so if you wiggle your finger, they'll jump on it, so they can check you out. Hey, how's it going? So that's pretty neat. And then there's some, of course, that are not cute at all. That thing is really wicked looking. Amazing that that's an actual organism instead of something that somebody thought of, right? Those spines probably protect it from parasitoid wasps. The wasps want to sting that spider and paralyze it, put it in a hole, and lay eggs on it, and then the baby wasps will eat that spider while it's still alive, paralyzed. So it doesn't want that to happen. So over evolutionary time, they grew these spines, which make them wider than they really are. And so the wasp can't fit it in its hole. It would have to dig a really big hole. And so they leave these ones alone if they've got the spines. And then I've got this one. This is kind of interesting. You look at that, probably especially from back there, and you'd think, that's not a spider, Professor Draney. That's an ant. And that's exactly what that spider wants you to think, of course. So here, this is the spider's head, right up here, and that's eyes, and that's its abdomen. But it's trying to mimic an ant, which has 3 body parts, and so its legs have this tuft of hair here that look like a head, and then the end of its legs, it moves like antennae, so it doesn't walk with those legs. It uses that like a little puppet. And then the really amazing thing, too, is that it mimics a different kind of ant when it's a baby, and then it mimics an ant in a different genus when it gets to be an adult. So pretty cool. A lot of ant mimic spiders out there. Next. Both these spiders and birds are found almost everywhere that animals can be found on the planet. So really all terrestrial and semi-terrestrial habitats, they're major parts of those ecosystems. From the wettest, the driest, the hottest, coldest, highest environments, all have birds and spiders. So I want to focus on 2. I've already talked a little bit about the penguins. So next slide. Oh, it's pausing. So yeah, so in the ocean and in Antarctica, there isn't very many birds, but certainly the penguins are amazing. There's no spiders. It's so cold in Antarctica that actually there are no species of spiders that live there. But there are some arachnids. There's some mites that live in Antarctica. They're the only some of the very few permanent land-dwelling animals on Antarctica. And then I wanted to...
Well, on the penguins?
They actually eat little springtails, and they eat each other, and they eat little roundworms. So yeah, they don't. There probably are some that benefit from penguin poop, but they don't eat the penguins. There are some that live on penguins. So there's mites and lice that live on penguins. So that's a good point. And then I want to talk about this little spider too. This is the highest permanent land animal that's ever been discovered. It lives on the slopes of Mount Everest, up to 22,000 feet. Where it's kind of permanent winter up there. It's a very harsh habitat. Yaks are the highest land mammal, and they only live up to 19,000 feet. So it's the highest land multicellular animal that we know about. And you're probably thinking to yourself, but a spider is a predator, so what is it eating up there? What it eats is seemingly insects that either fall out of the sky or blow up the mountain, like little dead, dried up bugs that blow up there, and it scavenges those. So that's a really impressive jumping spider there. It's got a cool name too. Its specific epithet is omnisuperstes, which means it lives above all. So that's pretty cool. Okay, next one. Next slide. So this is just even underwater you can find these lineages. Pretty unusually, but pretty cool. I don't know how many of you have ever seen these dippers, American dipper. I saw this when I was a kid in Colorado. We were camping, and I thought that I was insane. I thought I had just gone insane. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This bird just sort of walks under there, and it's just like walking on the rocks under there, and it's got this kind of layer of air around its feathers, and it's all shiny, and it just looked like, what are you looking at? And I was like, birds don't do that. That's crazy. There's spiders that live underwater too. Unfortunately, these don't live in Wisconsin, so we don't have them around here. But in Europe and Asia, there's this thing called the water spider that makes a web underwater that's like a diving bell. And then it can hold bubbles of air on hairs in its abdomen. So it goes up to the surface, gets a bubble, takes it under, and scrapes the bubble off, and then it goes up into the diving bell. And it fills this diving bell up with air. And then it can hang out under there, and so there's some prey it caught. So it can hang out under there and feed, and it's safe from fish because it's in this bubble, and it's safe from birds because it's underwater, and so it's its own little spot there. So it's an underwater spider. Next. So both lineages, of course, are very ecologically important because they have, they're so abundant. They weigh so much in the environment. So this is just an illustration of that. This is a study that was done in probably the most diverse ecosystem on the planet. It's a rainforest on the slopes of the Andes in Peru. It's called Tambopata. And they estimated the weight of all the animals on like a hectare of rainforest. And what we see here is, first of all, that arthropods are super important. So these are ants and termites are like 25% of all the animal weight. And here's other insects. Here's the soil insects. But over here is arachnids. It's a kind of a small piece of the pie there, but it compares pretty favorably. There's probably more arachnids than there are amphibians or reptiles in the rainforest. And then over here is birds. So birds and arachnids are both pretty respectable chunks of animal biomass. So that makes them pretty important in most ecosystems. Next. And then, of course, both lineages are culturally significant. Maybe they have a very different role in our minds, but they're both important, I think, and everybody knows about them. So, first of all, of course, birds have got a really honored place, I think, in human culture. It's like the symbol. The bald eagle is the symbol of America, a really noble beast. Next, spiders don't have quite the same sort of place in our, sort of more negative aspects, but still, I think, quite important in the psychology of people. This is a drawing or an illustration of a god of these people that lived in South America around the time of the Incas. They're called the Moche, and sort of a warlike people, and they worshipped this kind of scary god. This god was called the Decapitator, and the Decapitator was basically like this spider with this head, in its abdomen there, this god's head or something, and this god needed blood. And so they would do human sacrifice, to this god. But I think they were definitely thinking of spiders that caught insects and then fed on their blood. And so, it was, an important part of their religion, of course, but it's an important part of everybody's, I think, mindset. So they're important. Both of these lineages are very seasonal in Wisconsin. And of course, everything is seasonal in Wisconsin, right? Because the winter is an incredibly harsh thing. Think about this. Very few organisms on this planet can survive a Wisconsin winter. Like probably 95% of organisms would just simply die if they were up here. So they have to find different ways to kind of survive in this region. Next. So of course you're all familiar with birds and the fact that a lot of birds, not all of them, but a lot of birds migrate, and they make these really huge intercontinental migrations, neotropic, down to the neotropics in the Caribbean. And so that's really fascinating, and we're really pleased to see them coming back now. Next. But spiders kind of do a similar thing, but they obviously can't move long distances. What they do is they sort of migrate in time. They kind of hang out, and they're inactive during the winter. And then they come up, and they're only active when the birds are here, but they're sort of a temporal migrant instead of a spatial migrant. So this is pitfall trapping for this species that lives in leaf litter, and this was in South Carolina, this data that I have, and you can see the adults are really only found for a short time of the year, and it actually turns out to be for this species from November to April. So it's actually a winter dwelling spider. It's actually most active in the winter. So there's different spiders that are active at different times of the year, just like birds. Next. And then another thing about spiders is they really depend on the snow to help them survive, because the snow insulates them and keeps the temperature underneath the snowpack much more moderate. And it might be 20 degrees below zero up here, and it's always going to be right around freezing here. And so they produce antifreeze in their bodies, and as long as it doesn't get too cold, they don't freeze. And so there's actually some spiders that are active and feed and even reproduce in the winter, even here in Wisconsin. So that's kind of an interesting thing about spiders. Next. Something that they have in common is birds and spiders are both very mobile organisms, right? Of course, everyone knows that birds are super mobile. They can fly. Well, spiders are very mobile too. They can fly too. But they don't fly in the same way. They balloon. And what we really mean is they produce a silken thread, and then a rising air current can pick up that thread and pick them up on rising air currents and travel. You can only do that if you're really tiny, right? We can't do that. If you have a little thread, it's not going to do anything. Even big spiders can't balloon. They have to be very small. But it's an important way for them to disperse to new areas and recolonize new areas. Next. Yeah, so this is just showing this is I think it's called the Himalayan goose, some sort of goose that lives and flies over the Himalayas. But this map shows all the places where birds come from Alaska. So, they summer in Alaska and breed in Alaska. And of course I knew that they came up, from America up to Alaska. But what's amazing to me is there's bird species that come from Southeast Asia and even from as far away as Africa to Alaska to breed. So it's amazing the kind of migrations you see. Next. And then this is us showing a spider with that silken thread. And they are actually just as capable of long-distance dispersal as birds. They're usually the first animals that you'll find on new islands that are formed by volcanic activity in the middle of the ocean. And Charles Darwin was really impressed by this. He was sailing around the world in the Beagle. You could be out in the middle of the Pacific, and one day a little spider would show up on the rigging of the ship. And so they can go to any place in the world, and they're some of the first things to arrive and sort of start to colonize. Next. Here's something you don't think about every day, but both of these animals are builders of structures, and that gives them something in common too. Next. So here's some cool bird structures. We usually think of just a regular bird nest, but some birds, of course, like these cliff swallows, make these really amazing, almost permanent, mud nests that they can recolonize every year, and other birds try to kick them out and live in there and stuff. This is not really a nest. This is actually a courtship platform for the bowerbird. So the male goes to all this trouble making this place where he shows off to females. And apparently the females are super attracted to blue objects, and so they go and they find blue objects. It's really hard to do, right? It's hard to find something blue. So they have to find all this blue stuff. They steal it from people and stuff, and then they show off to the females with that. It's a really interesting structure, isn't it? Next. Well, spiders make a lot of cool structures, of course, too. They're really famous for their silk and all the things they build silk with. And you usually think of like a spider web, it's a capture orb. But there's trapdoor spiders. They make the little lid of their trapdoor out of silk and also debris, moss and lichen and stuff, and they camouflage it. And what these guys are doing is kind of like fishing. So they'll have silk lines going out from the hole, and they hold on to it. And if a cricket were to trip that, they can feel it, just like you can feel the fishing pole go down, and they run out and capture the animal and bring it back where it's safe. Next. What's next? I guess you have to go up one more. Okay, yeah, so here's some even more impressive structures. These weaver birds in Africa make these really interesting kind of woven nests, almost like a sock. And then, of course, anybody who's ever seen a bald eagle nest has to be impressed by that. Bald eagles really aren't that heavy, but yet this nest, you could stand in it, it's like a tree house. It's pretty impressive. Next. And then here's some other kinds of spider webs. Here's a similar sort of woven spider web. This is a sheet web spider. I wasn't sure if I had any pictures of sheet web spiders for you, but these are the kind that I'm a specialist on, or sheet web spiders. This is called the filmy dome spiders. This is kind of like a cathedral dome, a basilica dome. And then this here is a fairly large spider web. This is a social spider. There's probably 300 or 400 spiders that cooperate to make this web. And I don't have a picture of a person here, but this would be about, Professor Draney would be right about there. So this is a pretty big web in the middle of South American jungle. So that's pretty big. And then every once in a while, these animals really can change the ecosystem with their structures. Now, birds can do this better. Birds are really got the handle on over spiders, but these seabird nesting sites are really like a force of nature. They are a geological force. They produce so much guano over thousands of years that people mine this stuff for fertilizer, right? It can be part of entire islands. And of course they keep trees from growing there, so they completely change the ecosystem where they nest. And then this is kind of the closest thing I can come with spiders. Every once in a while there'll be a mass ballooning event, right? Where it's just perfect weather and there's a whole bunch of spiders and they all balloon at the same time. And then they produce all of their ballooning webs kind of glom together to make gossamer. That's what we mean when we say gossamer. It's actually this spider web, which occasionally you can see it floating in the air, because that's where it came from. Most of the time you see it on the grass, and you can see this dog is walking underneath the gossamer. That's a pretty impressive, bunch of it there. But, anyway, so that's kind of a neat phenomenon. Next. Of course, we know that birds are going extinct around the world, and it's really a tragedy. Well, there's spiders also have members that are endangered, so I thought I'd show you a couple of those. Both of these groups are going to be organisms from Hawaii. Hawaii is it's a beautiful place. It's part of the United States, but there's an extinction crisis going on in Hawaii. It's got some of the highest rates of animal and plant extinction any place on the planet is on Hawaii. And it's because all these animals and plants evolved only on Hawaii and nowhere else. And then you get all these invaders from outside that outcompete them and eat them and kill them and stuff. So and these birds are affected by malaria, avian malaria, which didn't used to occur in Hawaii. So they're really sensitive to it. We brought mosquitoes and the malaria into Hawaii. There used to be mosquitoes in Hawaii. And so now the only place you can find native birds in Hawaii is where it's really high up, where it's too high for the mosquitoes. Every place else, they're all pretty much extinct. And this one is getting there. There's very few of them. I think there was 3 of them or something last time I checked. So they're probably going to go extinct. It's really sad. People are working really hard to save them, but there's 3 of them, so that they're probably going to go. This one may well survive, this spider here, but people don't think about that, but there are endangered spiders. Spiders are going extinct all the time. People just don't care about it as much. People don't know as much about it, so we don't really know all of them that are endangered. But this one's kind of an interesting one. It lives on Hawaii, so it's protected by the Endangered Species Act. It lives in caves. They're actually lava tubes. So it lives in lava tubes in Hawaii. And it's from a lineage of wolf spiders called the big-eyed wolf spiders. They have really big eyes. But this one lives in caves, and so over evolutionary time, it's lost its eyes. It doesn't have any eyes. And so it's the no-eyed, big-eyed wolf spider. So that's kind of cool. And it's endangered basically because we're withdrawing groundwater from Hawaii to grow sugarcane and to have golf courses and swimming pools and stuff. And so the water table is going too low to keep these lava tubes wet. And so the bugs that the spider eats can't survive there, and so the spider is dying off. So it's endangered too. I have better hopes that it might be able to survive, but probably only where we can't go, really deep down in these little cracks where we can't see them. Next. And of course, both of these lineages are really beautiful and fascinating organisms. They're some of the most beautiful organisms there are. And they both do this thing called courtship, right? Maybe for different reasons, but they do elaborate pre-mating displays, to kind of show off, and they're negotiating with each other. Are you the best mate that I can find? And it's oftentimes for both species, it's the males that are doing the courting. The males are the sexy ones, and the females are very choosy and very picky. And so the males show off and try to convince the female that they're really awesome, and then the female maybe will mate with them. With spiders, it's a little bit more complicated because the males are usually smaller than the females, and the females are serious predators. And so she might want to mate, but she might also be hungry. And so it's a real danger for males to be eaten by a female trying to court her. So they have to kind of they change the female's behavior from predator to lover, sort of switch this switch in the female's mind. But I don't know if you've ever seen these videos of the peacock spiders. Those are recently discovered. We didn't know about those before the 1990s. So really awesome lineage. It's just a little flap of skin that they sort of flap around, and they do these little arm waving motions and stuff. And then I would recommend this too. If you go to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology website, you can see these New Guinea birds of paradise, and they're an incredibly diverse group. This is just my favorite one. This male bird has this big shield of feathers that it basically is hiding behind. You can't tell that's a bird at all. That looks photoshopped, doesn't it? That is a bird, and it looks just like that in real life. And it's got this funny smiley face that it uses to communicate with a female. So anyway, it's amazing to see that in real life. So check out those videos. Next. So there's a lot of connections between birds and arachnids. And I'm going to talk about arachnids because there's not as many connections between birds and spiders, because spiders usually don't have tight, relationships with birds, but a lot of other arachnids have. So I want to look at those really tight relationships, mostly between spiders and mites first, and then we'll look at some spiders and other arachnids too. Next. So parasitism is an ecological relationship that is pretty important for most animals, and birds get a lot of parasites, and some of them are mites. So mites are really important parasites of humans, most vertebrates, and almost every animal has mite parasites. And so this is one kind of parasite that birds can get. And it's not funny, you know, it's sort of unhappy to see a parasitized bird, but this is an important part of the ecosystem. It controls the numbers of animals when they get too, when their population gets too high, the density gets really great, and so it makes it easier for the parasites to go from one bird to another. And so these parasites kind of keep the birds in a particular population level, and actually probably prevents more suffering from starvation, for example. So anyway, they're part of nature, and this is a mite that causes these growths on the feet of the bird. It's called a scaly leg, and this is the scaly leg mite here. Kind of interesting looking animals, actually, but there it is. Okay, next. Oh, so I forgot about that one. So obviously birds also get ticks, and there's other kinds of mites. Some mites, some parasites are ectoparasites. They live on the outside of the animal. But like this one is an endoparasite. It lives inside of the animal. So those are the two kinds of parasites. Next. They usually don't kill the animal, but what they do is they just make it harder for them to live. They reduce their fitness. That is, how many offspring do they have and how healthy are those offspring. And so that helps to control the populations of different organisms. Next. And then the other thing, of course, that can happen is that this mite could actually, when it moves from one bird to another, it can vector a disease, right? So the disease hops on board this mite when it's an infected bird, and then the mites go to another bird, and then they can transmit that disease, just like mosquitoes and malaria, right? So there's a lot of pathogens that get vectored by mites as well. And then we have commensalism, kind of a happier situation. Commensalism is when one organism really benefits from this relationship, and the other organism doesn't really care, or maybe doesn't even know about it. A great example of commensalism is face mites for humans. 90% of all of us have face mites. We have mites that live on our eyebrows and on those big pores in your nose, you know? And they basically eat that stuff that comes out of those pores, right? That kind of sebaceous secretion. And most people, it doesn't give any symptoms. You don't know whether you have them or not. So the mite totally depends on us for their lives, but we don't really care one way or another. And that's the way it is with some arachnids and birds. A lot of these little pseudoscorpions really love to live in bird nests. Next. So these are pseudoscorpions. They kind of look like scorpions, but much smaller. They're very tiny animals. And they don't have a stinger at the end of their abdomen because their pincers are venomous. So they don't really need a stinger. They've already got venomous pincers. They're too small to sting any human. Nobody can be harmed by these. But they're predators of mites and other small animals. And they're called pseudoscorpions or fake scorpions. And there's a lot of them in Wisconsin. You can find them right out there in the grass. In any square meter of grass, there will be a pseudoscorpion. And so a lot of them seem to live in bird nests, and there's a big list of pseudoscorpions that live in bird nests. And they seem to, they might be able to actually benefit the bird by eating mice and fleas and mites and stuff, but probably a lot of the birds just don't really care one way or the other. Next. So here's a paper that came out recently, sort of summing up all that we know about these bird nest pseudoscorpions, and they found 85 different species of pseudoscorpions, which sounds pretty good, but with the birds, they've only found reports of pseudoscorpions in 98 species of bird nests, and yet probably they're in almost every species of bird nest. So there's probably a lot more of these out there than what we know so far. Nobody really ever studies them, that's all. Next. Here's a really interesting commensalism, and it's almost universal among birds. Essentially, every bird that we've ever looked for in museum collections and stuff, inside of the feathers there are mites. They live in the hollow shafts of feathers, and they feed on, again, sebaceous secretions that the bird produces. A few of them are parasites and live on blood, but most of them just are harmless and they just live on the secretions. So they're called feather mites. Next. And every single bird we've ever examined has got at least one species of feather mite. Next. And a lot of the times these mites are very host specific. They only live on a particular species of bird. So this is a real benefit of birds, you might say. Birds have all this biodiversity that depend on them. And there's thousands of species of mites that occur just because of the feathers. There was a parakeet species they found that had 25 species of mites on one species of bird. Isn't that amazing? All different kinds of feathers. All the different kinds of feathers have a different kind of mite species. So this is, I just found this online. A colleague of mine studies these, And here's photos of 3 of these feather mites. They're really cool looking animals, right? Kind of weird looking animals. And they live on this particular species, beautiful wetland species, Sora rail. Okay, and then this is from National Geographic. Just came out this January. I don't know if anyone saw this one. It's called Mighty Mites. And this is a feather mite here, a really handsome animal, I think, and it has interesting adaptation. These are big suction cups on its legs that it uses to hang on to. It's like it has to rock climb up that feather, so it's got this, suction cups. Okay, next. So this is a really cool, this is probably one of the most interesting connections between birds and spiders. It's something called foracy. Foracy is when one animal basically hitchhikes on another animal and gets transportation from that animal. So it's not necessarily a parasite, they don't necessarily hurt them at all, but they depend on them for transportation. And in this particular case, we're talking about little mites that live in flowers. They're mostly predators, tiny insects that go to the flower, okay? And so it's a great place to be a predator because all these other insects are going to the flower. But if you're a tiny little mite, how do you get from one flower to another? And this is a big deal in the tropics because a lot of times these flowers only last for like one day and they're gone. And so the mite has to go to another flower somehow, but that would be like walking across the United States going from one flower to another, right? They're so tiny. And so what they do is they hitchhike on hummingbirds. Next. And they live they ride around in the nostrils of hummingbirds. And so the hummingbird is dipping its bill in to get some nectar, and it runs up into the nostril and gets in its little cockpit, and then it can survive that really fast flight without falling off, right? And so next, I think there's a little more detail here. The mites, they're flying around in the hummingbird, and they need to go to the right kind of flower. They can't just jump off anywhere. And so they can smell, apparently, if it's the right flower. And then they have to get off really fast because you know how hummingbirds are. They're only on the flower for just a second. And so they're super fast. They're some of the fastest animals in the world if you consider their body size. So how many body lengths can they go per second? They can really run fast. So they can go about 12 body lengths per second, which is about as fast as a cheetah can run, which is much faster than, say, Usain Bolt. It's about twice as fast as the fastest human sprinter. They can run, about 7 or so body lengths per second. So that's pretty impressive. Here they are. They're not very impressive looking, but impressive little system. Next. This is not the same mite. This is just a mite that's a predator. It's these little red mites that you see running around on your walls in June, say. This is the fastest land animal in terms of its body size that we've ever found. So what they did on this, these scientists did these back of the napkin calculations, and they were like, if all of these animals were the same size as Usain Bolt, how fast would they go? So here we have Usain Bolt can run 27 miles an hour. That's impressive, isn't it? 27 miles an hour. The cheetah can run 60. A horse can go 46 miles an hour. The fastest mite is a half a mile an hour. Big deal, right? I can walk way faster than that. But if the mite was as fast as or as big as Usain Bolt, it would be going, I don't know if you can read that, 1,415 miles per hour. Break the sound barrier. Of course, it really couldn't do that because as it got heavier, it would slow down. But if it was going that fast, that's how fast it's going in terms of its body length. So pretty impressive. Next. This is just a picture I found on the internet of the nostril of a hummingbird. If you've never seen that, it's pretty cool. And I couldn't resist showing this too. The hummingbird's an amazing animal. And of course, they have this incredibly long tongue that they use to get nectar out. And they've got this tongue, it's got a bone in it actually, and it goes through the bottom of the roof of the mouth, goes on either side of the head, these kind of ligaments, and then it attaches over on the beak, all the way over the head. This tongue bone of hummingbirds, just amazing. I didn't know that existed until I was doing research for this talk. Next. Okay, competition. There's probably a lot of competition between birds and arachnids because the spiders and the birds are eating the same bugs, right? And so if they eat more, then the birds will have less, and so on. Interestingly, this is very difficult to demonstrate in nature. It's really hard to prove that two organisms are actually competing so that one is being hurt, right, if the other one's there. And so I cannot find any information about spider-bird competition right there. So there's something for some scientists to do in the future. Next. Predation. This is where it's really all happening, right? Both birds and spiders are predators. Next. it goes both ways, actually. So obviously birds eat a lot of spiders, and it's a really important food source for them. But spiders, sometimes some spiders can eat some birds, so it goes both ways. So I'm going to start out with the arachnids next. So I'm going to first start out with arachnids eating birds. I hope I don't shock you, because this is like bird death here. But it's part of nature. Next. So first, scorpions eating birds. This probably doesn't happen very often, but a colleague of mine found a case of scorpions eating a bunch of birds. Next. And so it's Lenny Vincent. He's at University of California, and he was in South Africa, basically on vacation, and they found the most common bird in the world. It's apparently the most abundant bird in the world. It's called the clea, and it's really huge, kind of like the blackbirds here, right? These huge flocks of cleas in Africa, and he saw a huge aggregation of them. Next. In Kruger National Park. Next. And so in this one spot, there's a whole bunch of scorpions that he found. And he found the scorpions because the scorpion was attached to a dead bird. So there's all of these dead birds on the ground, and apparently they were juveniles that were flying a little bit, and they land on the ground, and they get stung by a scorpion, and the scorpion tries to drag it into its burrow. So they had captured by a leg a juvenile clea. Next. So this is some of the photos he took. Gives you an idea of how many cleas there were. So this is like a bush or a tree with the birds in it. Do you see that? That's a lot of birds. And then here's one of the dead birds. A poor little bird. This is the pedipalp, the chela, not the stinger, I don't think, but the chela of the. So it's in this little burrow here. Next. Here's another one. This one's already covered by ants, so you can see the ants are coming to move in. They're kind of like the lions and the hyenas or whatever, so they're going to try to steal the food from the scorpion. The scorpion's eating as fast as it can. Next. Okay. And then, of course, there's these big tarantulas. They're actually called bird-eating spiders. They don't specialize on birds, actually. They eat a lot of insects, but they are big enough to get small birds. And so this is, I don't know, Audubon or someone drew this picture. I don't know who it is. I can't figure out whose this is. A friend of mine sent me this, but there's a poor little, looks like a little bluebird or something being eaten by this large tarantula. Next. And so these are actually called bird-eating spiders. They're some of the biggest tarantulas in the world, and they occur in the neotropics. They're arboreal tarantulas. So most tarantulas live in burrows in the ground, but in the rainforest, some of them live in trees, and they live in holes in trees. And so these are arboreal tarantulas, some of the world's largest. So they get to be about 3 ounces in size, not quite a quarter of a pound, about 85 grams. Next. I did find an example of a relative of a tarantula that ate a snowy plover chick in, I think it was in California. So this is a trapdoor spider, like that little one I showed you before. And so that's just a report in a paper. And then occasionally birds might get caught in a spider web if it's a really big spider. We even have spiders around here that a hummingbird might catch, but this is a pretty good sized bird. It's like a robin or something, this chestnut-breasted manakin. And this is the biggest web-building spider in the world. So Nephila is the golden silk spider, and it gets to several inches in body size, and then the legs would be, like that. So it's a pretty impressive spider. And this one, they don't usually eat birds, but this one happened to be able to catch this mannequin. It's all over the internet. You may have seen that on the internet. And then here is a picture. I wanted to show you this one. This was trapped in a Nephila web, this poor little ruby-throated hummer. But they released it. They were at pains to say, we released this hummingbird and it survived. So anyway, there was a paper that was written about birds caught in spider webs. So here it is. Next.
Did you give any food to the spider for taking the...
Yeah, I know. It's not fair, is it? It's like you release the hummingbird and then the spider misses out. So, but you can see people are making choices. That's okay. So anyway, they found almost 70 cases of birds caught in spider webs. Next. And of course, they're mostly small birds and large spiders. So the mean bird size was 11 grams. Remember that big tarantula was 85 grams. So these are really small birds, mostly hummingbirds. 87% of the birds were less than 15 grams. So those are mostly hummers. The most common birds were hummingbirds, but the largest one was a dove, and it was 80 grams. So it's a medium-sized bird, Next. And then, of course, the most common spider was this one I've been showing pictures of, this Nephila. And all of them were orb weavers, right? The spiral orb web, except for the black widow, which makes a really impressive web. It has lines under pressure that are glued onto the ground. And then when animals are walking along, they trip those, and the lines spring them into the web. And so black widows catch snakes and lizards and mice and all kinds of big animals. So it's actually a pretty powerful predator. Next. So this is now, birds eating spiders is actually really ecologically important, and this is a big reason why you should be interested in spiders if you're interested in birds. Next. So, we say, oh, these birds are insectivores, but almost all insectivorous birds will also eat spiders. This is kind of a misnomer. They mean like all little arthropods. Next. And there are some birds that are kind of more dependent on spiders than others, that focus on spiders more. Next. And we're starting to find some really interesting science that's showing that some baby birds really need to have spiders in their diet. It's a really important part of their diet. They're different than insects. They're nutritionally different. So anyway, this is a picture from a colleague of mine, a good friend of mine, Don Buckle. And I just wanted to use this as a teaching moment. This is not a spider in this bird's mouth. This is a harvestman, or daddy longlegs. And so I want to make the point that those daddy longlegs are not spiders. They're also not venomous. People always say, well, they're the most venomous spider in the world, but they can't bite you. Well, they can't bite you, but they also don't have venom glands. So that's something that you should know as a naturalist. They're harmless to people. Next. So here's a little bit about the importance of spiders in ecology. We think of spiders as an energy shunt. Okay, let me walk you through this. Next. So most birds are in what we call the green food webs, right? So plants are growing, and then there's herbivores that eat the plants, and then there's carnivores that eat the herbivores, and then carnivores that eat the carnivores. That's kind of what you think of as a food chain. But that's not where most of the energy in an ecosystem goes. Most energy in the ecosystem is from a brown food web. Next. And the brown food web is just the fact that most plants don't end up getting eaten, right? The world is green. So most of the time, these plants turn into dead plant detritus, right? Leaves and dead sticks and dead roots. And eventually, they get eaten by detritivores. And so all that energy doesn't go into the green food web normally. It just stays in the soil, right? It doesn't support beautiful things like birds. But spiders are a link between the brown and the green food web. So you can see the plant makes detritus. The detritivores eat the detritus, little insects and mites and things. And then spiders eat those little insects. And then birds, salamanders, lizards, shrews are all eating those spiders. And then that energy goes into the green food web. So it's an interesting little shunt. Spiders are important in that way, we think. Next. Spiders are important. This is sort of a negative thing, but spiders are important in biological magnification, right? And this is when various kinds of toxins are lipid soluble inside of the bodies of organisms. And so they don't just get eliminated, when you go pee. They stay in your body. And so in a food chain, the animals that are higher in the food chain, they get a much higher dose of toxins, right? Because they have to eat like 10 times their body weight. Like a heron will have to eat 10 times its body weight in fish. The fish have to eat 10 times their body weight in algae. And so there's 100 times more toxins in the heron than there is in the algae, at least. There might be 10,000 times more. So that's really important for spiders. They kind of pass on toxins to birds and things like sometimes. So these toxins can bioaccumulate. Next. And that we now know that in particular, spiders that are living near wetlands are getting toxins from the aquatic system and transferring them to the terrestrial system. And so this is a paper that just came out in Science. That's a really big science journal, like a really important science journal. The movement of aquatic mercury through terrestrial food webs. And they were looking at fish-eating birds, which we knew are going to have mercury, and comparing them with these terrestrial birds. And some of these terrestrial birds, these wrens, they really love spiders. So 20 to 30% of their diet is spiders. And the spiders had a lot more mercury, 3 times more mercury than caterpillars, right, that are just eating plants. And it's because the spiders are eating like mosquitoes and midges that live in the aquatic system, and that's where the mercury is, right? The mercury goes into the sediment of the bottom of the wetland. And so these spider-eating wrens had higher mercury than the fish-eating kingfishers at the site, and twice as high mercury as the birds that are eating terrestrial food, right? Like owls and woodpeckers. So that's kind of a sad connection there between arachnids and birds. Okay, I want to talk about this special case of nectarivorous birds, right? Birds that mostly get a lot of their energy from nectar. And of course, we're usually thinking of hummingbirds, right? They rely heavily on spiders. There's two reasons. Next. One, of course, is that hummingbirds don't just drink nectar, right? You can't live on just nectar. You have to get protein to make, the body of the bird and to have eggs and stuff. And so in order to get protein, they eat a lot of spiders. Spiders are actually higher in protein than a lot of insects. And so a lot of these little birds are really good at catching spiders. They also use spider webs to make their nests, right? And a lot of people know that about hummingbirds, and it's true of other small nectarivorous birds too. Spider web is really good building material. It's actually stronger than silk in many ways for the weight. It's much lighter than, stronger than silk, stronger than steel than for its weight. It's much lighter than steel. So it's actually really impressive. They say if you could make a t-shirt out of spider web, it would be like a Kevlar vest. It would be like a bulletproof vest. So it's really impressive material, but the problem is most birds are so big that it would take a long time for them to collect enough spider webs to build their nest. But if you're really small, you don't need as much spider webs, and so a lot of small birds use spider webs to build their nests. So hummingbirds, of course. This is an interesting story I got from an arachnologist. He was at a place, Portal, Arizona, where there's a whole bunch of hummingbird feeders at this motel. And there's a whole bunch of spiders on this patio, and the birds would fly, and they seem to hit the spider web and then go down like this. Hit the spider web and then fly down over and over again. And what I think was going on, he wasn't quite sure, but they were probably knocking the spider off their web. Web-spinning spiders have something we call bail behavior. They bail out of their web. They jump out of their web, and they fall to the ground, and then they play dead. And of course, a hummingbird is so fast that they can catch the spider once it jumps out. So they were knocking the spider out of their web and then eating it down below. And so that was kind of an interesting behavior. I don't know if anyone's ever seen anything like that. It's not in the literature as far as I can tell. But anyway, here's a nice little hummer nest, and they decorate them with lichen and stuff. You can see how tiny they are, just really cute little things. But spider web is a really important part of that. You can see a couple of spider webs sticking out here. Next. And then there's some other ones too in other places. So these sunbirds, it's a family called the nectariids, right? They like to drink nectar. And there's sunbirds, and there's also these spider hunters, which is kind of cool. That's what caught my attention. So they're convergent with honey eaters in Australia and hummingbirds in the Americas. And they do the very same thing. They eat a lot of spiders, and they use spiders to build their web. So that's a regal sunbird. They're really beautiful, beautiful animal. Next. And then these are the spider hunters, my new favorite bird. I didn't know that they existed until recently. So it's a kind of nectaria. They're kind of a big honey creeper, and they're called, the genus is Arachnothera, which means spider hunter. That's what that means in Greek. So that's pretty cool. And they don't just eat spiders. That was sort of disappointing to me. But they do specialize on spiders. So they eat a lot of spiders, and apparently they're capable of extracting spiders from the center of their webs, which sounds kind of like what the hummingbirds do. I've never seen it. And then this is one more study that I think is really cool. The importance of spiders as food for baby birds. These passerine birds, little songbirds. Next. And apparently this one amino acid is really important for healthy brain development of baby vertebrates. And it's, of course, present in breast milk, for mammals, but the birds, they get the taurine from the food that the mother feeds the babies. Next. And it turns out that the spiders are a great source of taurine. They have 40 to 100 times more taurine than caterpillars of the same size. So they're really important for the birds. Next. And so they did this study looking at these animals called blue tits. And when they're really young, there's a certain size, 5 to 11 days, where the mothers switch over to hunting spiders, and they just really concentrate on spiders, and they mostly are giving them spiders during that time period. Next. And then so they did an experiment where they had baby tits, and they fed some of them high taurine diets and some low taurine diets. And the high taurine diet ones were greater risk takers, and they also were better at learning where they live and how to get back to their nest and stuff. So they're kind of like smarter birds. So that's really kind of cool. I want to show you this just for fun. It's just kind of really weird. A case of a connection between spiders and birds. And it's what I call a tritrophic connection. There's 3 levels of a food chain. Okay, so let me explain. It involves this snake called the spider-tailed horned viper. So it's a viper, like a rattlesnake, and it doesn't really have a rattle at the end of its tail, but it's got this interesting, weird tail. It seems to use this tail as a lure to attract foraging birds. So it's mimicking some kind of insect or maybe a spider. It kind of looks like a spider to me. It mimics this little insect, and it might not really be a spider, of course, but it's mimicking some little insect, and the bird goes down and tries to get that insect, and then it gets eaten by the snake. This is a newly discovered thing, too. The snake was discovered in the 90s, described in the 2000s, and then they didn't have a video of this behavior until very recently. Next. So this is a video which it might work if you press that. I saw this at the Arachnological Society meeting. Let's see if it works. So that's the snake's tail. And it does kind of look like
It looks like a critter.
some kind of critter. So I was really fascinated with that.
Makes his legs move like that.
Uh-huh.
Makes it look like legs.
Looks like a juicy abdomen. Next. Now this is one I'm not sure if we'll be able to boot up, but let's try. This is a YouTube video that actually shows a predation of a bird. So I'm warning you, it does contain a scene of bird mortality. If you're really into birds. I'm almost hoping the sound doesn't exist, but it's got really bad narration. But it's a really amazing footage that these nature photographers were able to get. Oh, we have to go through the advertisement. And then if you can make it big here, we can get big screen. Okay. Sorry about the ad.
It doesn't cost us anything.
Yeah. Okay, and again, we probably won't have the sound, but it doesn't matter. But I think this is really amazing. So this is in Iran. It takes a little while to get going here, but worth it. So here's the little bird. I don't know if anyone knows what kind of bird that is, but no one at the Stevens Point Audubon Society knew what it was. It's just a little, what I would call a piss bird. It's a hard to identify little bird. Yeah, some kind of little sparrow-like thing. I don't know. So did you see the little lure going on over there? So there's the bird. There's the lure. It's pretty good.
Very camouflaged snake.
Yeah, very much so. Now they're going to show the predation once, and then they're going to show it again. So if you miss it, they'll show it in slow motion. So this poor little bird, it's like, I got to get some more caterpillars. Okay, here it goes. So see that? It got hit by that snake, and it didn't even phase it. It still went after the snake, the fake lure again. So kind of hard to watch. It's hard to root for the snake, but the snake needs to get food too.
Yeah, I wonder how it's surviving over there with all the troubles.
Yeah, you do have to wonder about that.
Is it politically correct?
Yeah, right.
Or is it getting killed?
Right. I mean, fortunately, there's not that many people in a lot of the desert out there, so hopefully it's living someplace where there's not too many people. But obviously, it's not very well studied because it's only found in Iran, and how can you get permission to go to Iran to study snakes? It's probably not easy to do. Okay, really close to the end of the talk now. I've probably run over time, but yeah, you can get out of that if you want. I think you can push over here and it'll minimize it. Yeah. Yeah, and just close that out or something. Okay, yeah, I think this is the last slide now. The most important connection of all between birds and arachnids is they both depend on habitats, same habitats for, for survival. Next. So, you know, there's thousands of bird species, and they depend on the same kind of habitats and functioning systems as those spiders. Next. So it's something to think about. You know, habitats that have really high spider diversity also have really high bird diversity, and vice versa. So it's like, oh, I look at this, and you know, a birder would probably say, oh, that looks like an awesome place to find a lot of birds. And yeah, and it's you know, special plants and also special birds. I don't really know exactly what all those birds would be, but there's certain warblers and certain kinds of birds that you're most likely to find in the northern you know, swamp forest. Well, it's the same with the spiders. There's very particular species of spiders that I know I can find there. You know, the only place you can find saddle atlas marxi is in that kind of you know, habitat. So we have a very common interest if you're interested in birds or any other thing in nature. That's why I love birders so much, because birders are interested in protecting nature, and it protects everything if you protect birds. So that's pretty much it. I'd be happy to entertain questions about spiders or whatever, but thanks.
When the arachnids go into hibernation,
Uh-huh.
how do they maintain their homeostasis?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if you heard that. How do spiders survive the winter? Basically, how do they stay alive? The interesting thing is almost none of them overwinter as eggs. You might think, well, that's the stage they're going to be in. And people always say, oh, do you see that spider egg sac? It's going to overwinter, and then the babies will hatch in the spring. It's not really true. What happens is they embryonate inside the egg sac, and they turn into little baby spiders. And then both babies and adults can overwinter in different species. And essentially what they do is they produce antifreeze chemicals in their bodies. It's like they produce glycols that are a lot like propylene glycol and ethylene glycol that we put in our cars for antifreeze. And it lowers the freezing point of the cells in their bodies. And then they dehydrate themselves to some extent too, so they lose as much water as possible, making them really thick and hard to freeze. And so that they just mostly stop eating. Most of them don't eat in the winter, and they just kind of hang out and avoid freezing by being really kind of filled with solids, filled kind of salty, really salty, so they don't freeze. Good question. Yeah, back in the back. Yeah, question about, do we have the brown recluse around here? The basic answer is no. The range of the brown recluse extends to the middle of Illinois, right about where Champaign is the northernmost edge for brown recluses. Now, having said that, that's good news for us, right? There's no recluses up here. But having said that, you can move brown recluses pretty easy in your suitcase, in your moving stuff. And they like to live in boxes of paper and stuff like that in people's houses. And I myself have actually found, you know, people have brought me brown recluses from Appleton area, actually. So you know, you can find them here. But I really want to make a plea that you not worry about brown recluses in Wisconsin. There has not been a documented case of brown recluse spider bite in Wisconsin yet, despite the fact that I've heard from hundreds of people that have told me that doctors have told them that they've been bitten by a brown recluse. It's probably not happening hardly ever. Let me give you a little bit of evidence here. Down in Oklahoma, people get bitten by brown recluses, no question. There's a lot of brown recluses. They trapped them in people's houses. You can find 2,000 brown recluses in one house in Oklahoma. Okay? So that's what you're looking at there, 2,000 of them in your house. And 6 people get bitten every year in Oklahoma, approximately. On an average year, about 6 people get bitten. Okay, so there's like two brown recluses in somebody's house somewhere in Wisconsin. What are the odds that you're going to encounter that spider and it's going to bite you? I don't think it happens. I don't think people are getting bit by brown recluses. But people get, you know what they get? They get infections. They get flesh-eating bacteria. They get MRSA. And they go to the doctor, and the doctor says, yeah, that looks like a spider bite to me. Doctors really are not very well versed in spider bite. It's not a common thing. It's a rare thing. The other thing I have to say is, if you get bit by a spider, it's just like getting stung by a wasp. You're not gonna find a bump the next day and say I got bit by a spider. It's gonna really hurt because they're sticking these needles filled with venom in your body. It really hurts to get bit by a spider. And so occasionally someone will get bit in their sleep. That does happen, but for the most part, people know right away because you see a spider biting you. So I always ask people, where's the spider? And when there's a spider there, then I might believe them that it was a spider bite. It's actually a fairly rare occurrence for people to get bit by spiders. I have not been bitten by a spider. I've handled thousands of spiders with my bare hands. Yeah.
Don't you say that their mouth parts are not strong enough to?
Yeah.
Skin?
So you can get bit by spiders, but really only big spiders. They have to be over a centimeter or so in body length. So that would be a pretty good-sized spider in Wisconsin, right? Any small little spider that's smaller than about my pinky nail, they can't bite people. Their jaws are just not strong enough to get through skin. So that's another thing. Of all the spiders you see, if you see little ones, baby ones, they can't bite you. They can't bite anybody. So anyway, I always try to stick up for the spiders. And it's not just because I like spiders. That's not the reason, right? It's because people really worry about this, and it causes a lot of fear, and then people are spraying insecticides to kill spiders, it should never be done. The insecticides are so much more dangerous to you and your grandkids than the spider ever was. And so I understand there's good reasons to use insecticides, right? If there's a yellow jacket nest in your attic, you might want to go for the insecticide. But most of the time, if you can avoid it, you do not want to use pesticides unless it's absolutely necessary. Okay? That's my professional opinion. Any other questions about spiders? Thank you. I appreciate it. Great audience. I appreciate it.